Welcome to Raising Consciousness with me, Lou Burrows, where raising human consciousness happens. On this show, I'm joined by guests to cover a range of topics and have conversations that will raise human consciousness for current and future generations. Now, let's dive into today's show. Hi everyone, welcome back to Raising Consciousness with me, your host, Lou Burrows. And today on the show, we have Diva Diaz, who is joining us. Diva, thank you so much for being here. I was reading through your story, your journey, and definitely wanted you to come on to a podcast. So for those who don't know who you are, I usually start these episodes by asking the guests to introduce themselves. So if you could introduce a little bit about like who is Diva ultimately, and then we'll dive into the meat of the conversation today, which I know is a great one.
Thank you so much for having me. It's interesting because I come from a corporate background, but after many years of, I think, trying to fit in and I'd say be a lot more like everyone else, I got just exhausted and burnt out. And so I discovered this set of tool and techniques called Access Consciousness that I then kind of dove into. And now I am a facilitator. So I give seminars and classes and talks to people using these tools that allow you to have more of your own consciousness. And in particular, when it comes to neurodiversity, that's one of the areas that I kind of specialize in and I enjoy talking about because it's an area that's very close to my heart. So I've managed to change a lot in my life from being, very stressed out, a lot of masking, a lot of trying to do things the way that other people do them, to actually being able to find the way that works for me to function in the world in general and thrive using that. So
Amazing. No, so I was looking through, as I mentioned at the beginning, your story, reading through everything, and yeah, I came across Access Consciousness, and like obviously the program and stuff. So talk to us a little bit about like what that is, because obviously this show is called Raising Consciousness. I'm on like that journey of diving into everything consciousness ultimately. So I was definitely intrigued by this, and would love to kind of learn more about this Access Consciousness, like what it is, how you discovered it, and hopefully that can also help other people, our listeners and stuff, to start their own consciousness journey and stuff, really.
Absolutely. So Access Consciousness was introduced to me by a lady that I met online, accidentally or not, who knows. While I was living in Peru, I was working there on a project. I used to work in business intelligence, so my job involved being placed in different countries for a period of time and just, studying the economy there, working with heads of state, ministers in government, and the private sector too. And I was incredibly stressed. I didn't sleep a lot, had a lot of energy. And so I was looking for anything that kind of gave me more of a sense of relaxation and just kind of to turn off the monkey mind and, turn off what felt like being overstimulated 24/7. So I studied a bunch of modalities, a bunch of things that felt good for the moment that I was doing them. But the moment I stopped doing them, everything would creep back in and it was like nothing really changed. So anyway, this lady introduced me to these tools, which was so simple. It was about asking questions that allow you to access your own consciousness. So you didn't have to follow anybody, you didn't have to do what anybody else said, you didn't have to sign up to anything. You just use these questions. And I started because honestly, I had nothing to lose, but I had already decided I'm not going to be doing any more of this alternative stuff anymore. None of that's helping me. But when I came across these questions, I thought, well, let me give it a go. And almost instantaneously, I started to have more of a sense of me and less of that kind of like frantic angst that you tend to get, that is very easy to hide sometimes and sometimes not so much.
In terms of like the program, and you mentioned questions there, can you give us a little bit of insight into actually what are these questions? In my own consciousness journey, I realized how important the questions we ask ourselves are. So yeah, if there's any insight that you can give into actually what are some of these questions that our listeners and viewers of this podcast can take away to start to access their own consciousness and hopefully raise their consciousness as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd say the first question that I really use all day long still to this day is, what am I perceiving here? What am I aware of? And it's a very easy question to ask yourself. You don't need to look for the answer outside of you, and you don't need to even know cognitively what it is that you're perceiving. But, in terms of, say, neurodiversity as an example, people who are neurodiverse very often are told that they're overly sensitive, and they do get very stimulated by sounds, by light, by so many things. And when you start to ask, what am I perceiving? What that does is it starts to take away that sense that whatever it is that's going on for you belongs to you. So if you do have that overstimulation, rather than having it be something that's now your problem that you have to handle, when you ask, what are you perceiving? You're almost recognizing that it's an energy outside of you, it's a noise outside of you, it's an intensity outside of you. And what that does is it actually allows you to have some space so that you recognize, oh, this isn't me. This isn't my thing that's going on. This is something that's outside of me. So it's so simple, but that simple shift in perspective is enough to actually give you like a break mentally, and a bit of space so that you can actually recognize that a lot of the stuff that may be stressing you out or may be super intense to handle isn't stuff that's within you, it's stuff that's outside of you. And so that already begins to shift your consciousness so that you can have a conscious awareness of, okay, this is what's me, and this is what's outside of me that's something that I'm perceiving.
And where does judgment come here? Because I think a lot of people, like in those situations, sometimes might, and I've been guilty of this myself. Like that self critic, that self judgment
Yeah.
as well. Like, so where does that fit into like the conversation?
Yeah. Well, judgment is an interesting thing because it's what we're taught to do since we're very young. When we're about 7, we're told, like, stop having so much fun. You've got to start behaving like an adult now. You're not a little child anymore. Like, sit still. This is what's right. This is what's wrong. This is what's good and bad. And so that begins our journey on trying to determine everything around us as good, bad, right, or wrong, which is all the judgment. So when we're so taught to do that, what tends to happen is that everything that we perceive or pick up on, whether it's somebody's mood, whether it's a result that we've had in our own life, whether it's I don't know, an exam that's coming up that perhaps we're nervous about, all of that we then have to also try and judge. Is this thing good? Is it bad? How am I in regards to it? Am I good? Am I bad? Am I going to fail? Am I going to succeed? And it's actually the judgment that starts to create that inner turmoil and inner conflict. So, it can be very easy to say, well, just let it go, which I've done a lot of things before that were like, just let it go. And I'd be thinking, well, if I could, wouldn't I be letting it go already? So the next step is, well, what do you do when you recognize that you've got those judgments that seem to be there, however hard you try to not have them? And one of the tools that I use a lot is, again, a very simple shift in perspective, is to say to yourself, interesting point of view that I have this point of view. So recognizing that a judgment isn't real just because you might think it is, just because it's there every single day, doesn't mean it's real. It's just a point of view. So when you start to say to yourself, oh, how interesting that I have this point of view, that's an interesting point of view that I think that I'm wrong in this situation. How interesting. What happens is it starts to get rid of that polarity and um, that kind of stress that judgment can cause. And it puts you again in the driving seat because it allows you to recognize, this is a point of view outside of me. This is a perspective that I'm choosing to have, or that this person is choosing to have. So again, it's not about like shifting blame or not taking responsibility for your own thoughts and emotions. It's not that, but it's about putting a little bit of distance between you and that so that you can look at it from a like bigger picture perspective and not be so inside it that you have this tunnel vision and you can't see anything but the judgment.
From what I understand, this has helped you in your um, diagnosis with autism, I believe. So
Yeah.
I'm kind of interested in like the life before, like you coming across like these questions, even just like the concept of consciousness, right? like what was life beforehand and what's life been like since, and like that transformation. So hopefully it can give insight again to our uh, audience today on like the power that it
Yeah,
has, if that makes
absolutely.
sense.
I'd say that the shift is huge and it's really very internal, and personal, if you like. So before, I used to always just think that there was something inherently off with me. I didn't know what it was. I didn't have enough information about it, but I was just always off, like I worked in intelligence and I would see my colleagues read and read and read and study, and I couldn't do it in the same way that they did. I could read, a page 75 times and then at the end not be able to tell you what was written on that page because I would have no idea. I was just going through the motions. But I quickly discovered that if I were to glance at the page, I would remember the image of the page, and from there I could pull the information. So I started to recognize, for example, that the way that I thought was very different to other people. And I recognized that I actually think in pictures, as one example. So for me, that was quite revolutionary to realize that people thought in different ways. And it started to make a lot of sense why communication was sometimes a little bit stuck or didn't really flow very well, or why I felt misunderstood, or why I didn't understand people at other times. So when I then discovered these tools, and I started to ask myself these questions, like, another question is, what's right about me that I'm not getting? What's right about this situation that I'm not getting? Or how am I perceiving this? How am I receiving this information that perhaps other people aren't? Very simple questions, but actually, in its simplicity, it allows you to uncover a whole new way of thinking and perceiving and receiving information. Um, that perhaps you haven't looked into. And so when I started to do that, what happened was a lot of what I thought was wrong with me, or me just being a bit crazy, I discovered was actually a capacity that I had. It just didn't look the same way that anybody else, behaved or did things. So because of that, it was hard
Mm,
to define how it could be useful or how I could use any of that to my advantage in life, in daily life. But when I started to recognize, oh, I just read in a
mm,
different way, I receive information in a different way. I am a visual thinker. So if somebody describes something to me in a more visual way at work, for example, I'm going to understand far more easily. And because of that capacity to think in pictures, I can see the bigger picture of everything and therefore offer solutions before the problems have even shown up that perhaps other people would miss because they were thinking in a more linear way. But it was only whilst I started to ask these questions that I realized that these
mm.
were abilities that I had, just in a very different direction than, neurotypical people.
Yeah, interesting. And so again, like reading through your story, you got diagnosed with this in your adulthood. The question I'm kind of pondering now is, do you feel like looking back, like in reflection, you also had it when you were growing up
Yeah.
in childhood as well? One reason I'm asking that is because I think the more older that I've got, I've kind of potentially associated with some of the certain, I'm not even sure like what you would call them, but like, so in terms of, certain likes, like just bother me, I guess, and just being able to like communicate. And so I'm also wondering, is it something that as you get older, do you start to become more aware of? And yeah, I'm just kind of like interested in that really, and also if it's like on a
Yeah.
scale as well, like autism and OCD and ADHD, like like all of these things. Like, is it also on a scale? Do you feel like we're all on that scale in some way, like in just some different levels? So yeah, a few questions I had to kind of unpack that. Obviously, we can kind of go back and forth with, but it's kind of coming from that place of like myself, just like kind of as I've grown older, noticing different things within my
Yeah.
own life, I guess.
I love that you're asking this because I think it's something that, a lot of people experience, that there are changes, as we grow older, as we experience life, as we go through different big events in our lives too. We will react differently, and there'll be times where we are more at peace, other times when we're more stressed. Um, and I'd say that one of the the more challenging things is when we try and define this is exactly what I have all the time, then it makes it very difficult to notice when you're actually experiencing changes in that, you know. So I'd say for me, I definitely did have all of this growing up, but I, I had a very interesting childhood that was filled with a lot of the stuff going on at home. So these things weren't really the focus. So I had to just force myself to fit in and make do. And I'm actually very grateful for that. Some people may see that as a terrible thing, and I really don't. I see it as really great because it did give me a lot of other skills, um, and show me how to kind of be very functional in many ways. But again, as you're talking about discovering that you're getting perhaps more sensitive to light or sounds or different things, I'd say for me that it also depends on the day. Some days when I'm tired, if somebody claps their hands next to me, I could cry from the pain. It gets so intense, it's almost painful. Well, it is painful, you know. But other days, if I have great energy, I have had a good rest the night before, I'm not stressed, you could be clapping next to me and it has a far less of an intense effect. So I think part of this too is to um, the thing of getting out of judgment that you mentioned earlier is when we get out of judgment of ourselves, it's also a way to be kinder with ourselves, to recognize that some days are more challenging than others, and that's okay. It doesn't mean that that's your permanent state. And some days are easier than others, and that's also okay. It also doesn't mean that that's the permanent state, but as you start to just be kinder on yourself, it also makes it easier to recognize what's going on. Sometimes would have a lot of intensity. For me, it's usually with sound that's very intense for me more than light. And if I were at, a business conference, there'd be a lot of sounds, I would get very stressed. But because I wasn't asking myself the question, what am I perceiving? What's going on here for me? I would assume that my stress was due to the job or the person that was in front of me that I was talking with. I didn't really have the self awareness at the time to recognize that it was something else that was going on. And so, one of the huge gifts of using these questions of access consciousness is to recognize that it's not necessarily about what's directly in front of you. If you're having a bad day or you're overstimulated, maybe you're with your mum or your partner and suddenly you want to just like scream and you think, oh, it's because I'm with this person, they must be so annoying. you know is it really that, or what is it that you're actually perceiving that led up to this moment? And so that actually creates a lot of these a lot more ease, I should say, in relationships, and then just recognizing what is working for you in your life and what isn't, rather than kind of not really knowing all the time and trying to figure out what is it that's wrong with me, that I tend to have difficulty in all these situations. So it allows you to just have more clarity, yeah, in that area, I'd say.
Yeah, because like for me, I guess I've been trying to like distinguish whether it's related to some of the points that we're talking about today, um, or if it's like so a bit of like a track back in terms of like my own story and journey. So when I was about 18, like severe anxiety, like depression, etc., etc., and I kind of point that as a very pivotal point in like my journey of
Yeah,
like before and after type of thing. Um, of like beforehand, I wouldn't be like so sensitive with just external stimuli, right? Whether that's be light, sometimes sound. At one point it was mostly like light, etc. I had to wear like sunglasses like all like
yeah,
most of the time because of the sunlight, etc. And in kind of going through that experience ultimately, and it was for a good few years, I was like operating in that state, and then like coming out like the other side of that, I feel like some effects still of that. And so I'm in like my own self-discovery kind of process and journey, like trying to work out actually, was it that situation that then sparked a lot of like these other, maybe even like long-term effects of
yeah,
that, if that makes sense. But then again, like having come across more of like neurodiversity, also resonating with some of the things, with like light, etc. So yeah, I guess I'm asking these questions for like selfish reasons, but it's just interesting of like in my again my own story, my own journey, like the before and
Yeah,
after it, if that
absolutely. It
makes
really
sense.
does. And I think, you've touched upon something interesting too, which is like you don't need to be diagnosed necessarily to recognize that there may be elements of these that do resonate with you, and that I've seen a lot of stuff online where people are saying that that's, a call for attention or all these different things. And I think that we're at, a time in history where it's actually great that we can talk about these things and recognize that we're not all exactly the same all the time. There are going to be days where certain things resonate with you and other times when they don't. And I think being an allowance of that and not judging ourselves when that comes up and not judging others too is a huge tool actually in being able to have ease with it, whether it means changing it and making sure that that doesn't affect you anymore, or whether it means actually getting diagnosed and recognizing, okay, there is something going on here that I might like to address. So yeah, I'd say it's so different. And again, talking about the spectrums, like autism is a spectrum, and the same with OCD and ADHD. Like not everybody has it to the same extent. So for me, these questions again are so key because what they do is they tap into what's going on for you. So rather than trying to give you this overarching label, which I'm not saying it's bad to have a label or good or anything, but rather than trying to make you fit into yet another box, it's actually going, well, you know what, Luke, like, what is it for you today? How is the world for you today? How are you perceiving things today? Today, how is it that you're receiving this information? And what would make that easier for you? Is this yours, this angst or this, incredible kind of like extreme sensory capacity, if you like, or are you actually just perceiving things around you on a very high volume? I mean, I talk about people on the autism spectrum, particularly um, being able to perceive the world on a very extreme volume range. So if the rest of the world is perceiving the world on a volume from 1 to 10, they might be perceiving it from a volume of 1 to 1,000 or 1 to 10,000. So their spectrum of perception is so much more varied, detailed, and intense. So even just recognizing that can, give us a lot of information on, okay, so what's going on for this person? And again, not trying to put them into a box, but asking a question, what's actually going on for this person today?
Trauma. How can trauma play a part or role within this? As you're talking there, it just actually, I think you mentioned it beforehand as well in terms of like the events of our lives, and then it just kind of like came to me as you were talking there. Of like, actually, I wonder how trauma can maybe trigger some of this, or like, yeah.
Yeah.
Anyway, trauma. What's your thoughts on the association with trauma and
Yeah.
what we're talking about here?
Oh, that's a great question. And I think a huge topic that we could probably talk for hours on as well. So it's got so many interesting, things that we could address. I would say, from my experience and my experience working with thousands and like tens of thousands of people worldwide in the last, I don't know, 15 years or so, what I have realized is that when there is a level of trauma, what can happen is that the person's sense of perception can be heightened. So if there's somebody who is already, you know, um, like experiencing the world in a very detailed way, whereas others perhaps are not so much, it can sometimes put them into kind of this overdrive. I know for me, for example, I broke my spine 2 years ago in two places, which was not very fun. But what it did was it almost put my body and just my entire sensory awareness on like this overdrive. So everything was so much more extreme. And that's one example of physical trauma, that we can measure. Um, but yeah, I think it depends on the person, um, and what it is that's going on for them. But even recognizing that, it can be so easy to think in those moments where everything's intense, everything is wrong. There's a huge problem. I'm completely messed up, or but even recognizing, oh, okay, is it just that I've got a lot going on at the moment? So how do I break this down? So what is the first thing that I need to address here? What would actually be a contribution to me?
And the world that we live in today isn't necessarily, in terms of like social norms and structures, maybe like set up for these types of conversations and stuff. Although I feel like there is a change. What do you feel like needs to happen at kind of like that bigger scale on like a societal or even world level in terms of everything that we've been discussing about today with neurodiversity and autism, etc. Like, what's your thoughts and feelings on social constructs and social norms, etc., that
Yeah.
surround us all?
That's such a great question. And, I think it's one that is ever evolving. And I'm personally so grateful, that we can even have this conversation today because 10 years ago, it wouldn't have been the same. For me, what I would love to see is people who are neurodiverse judging themselves less. I think that in itself can be revolutionary in the world. Why? Because, you can't really change other people. And we all know this, and it sounds cheesy, but it's true. You can't force other people to be less judgmental when it comes to people who are different in any way. But what you can do is as you start to get out of the self criticism, the self judgment, what happens is you're going to have a quiet confidence that starts to run through people who are neurodiverse. So, in that, and what I've seen through the work that I do with Access Consciousness is that people who perhaps would have second guessed themselves or constantly been in doubt or perhaps backed down when their ideas didn't match what everybody else was thinking, suddenly have this quiet confidence where they don't think they're right, they're not trying to fight against others, but they stand their ground a little bit more. So what happens is they start to be heard in a different way. And because they start to be heard in a different way, ideas that they had, using the workplace as an example, might be listened to, and they might actually be given a chance to try these new off the cuff things or things that are outside the box because they're not focusing number one on having to handle this self criticism that we're so used to. But what they're actually now turning their attention to is their awareness, their bigger picture perspective, because they do think in images a lot of the time. What are the different scenarios and situations that they can foresee already that perhaps others have missed? And in that, what happens is you start to create, um, you know, these this empowerment, I'd say, where without having to go against anybody or fighting against society or fighting against, you know, discrimination, whatever, you're actually fighting for your own awareness, fighting for your own abilities, and for having, these capacities where you can actually function very, very well in society and thrive in any situation, not despite your difference, but because of your difference.
And masking. I came across this word
Yeah.
in your story when I was reading through. Well, what is it?
Yeah.
Like, what is
Yeah.
masking?
So masking is, putting on a mask and basically fitting in very, very well. Scientifically, it's said that women are very good at this. So, a lot of women who are diagnosed later on in life or not with some of these labels of so called disabilities, they have been very good at masking and not allowing people around them to see what's really going on for them. But what happens over time is it does create a level of exhaustion, which is definitely what happened for me. I was so good at, fitting in, but at the same time having so much going on in my head and so much that I was having to handle internally to deal with social situations, to deal with overstimulation, and to deal with even random things like, I'm writing a book at the moment, and one of the things that I was recently writing is that there has not existed one step or stairway that I have walked up or down in my life where I have not counted every single step. So doing that in your head while attempting to, you know, be engaged in a conversation with somebody at the same time just gives you a little bit more work than the neurotypical person who is perhaps only just concentrating on the conversation, whereas I'm there counting the steps, counting the syllables, making seeing patterns in all the angles of everything, and many other fantastical things. And so what masking can create is, yes, it's an ability to fit in, absolutely, And it's also a huge gift if you recognize that you've been doing it, because it allows you to just relax into yourself a little bit more, and not feel that you have to work quite so hard to fit in to be like everybody else.
Has mindfulness and like meditation that helped you, or maybe even like your clients, people that you've worked with, and what are your thoughts
Yeah.
on these
I
practices?
think those practices are really great if they work for you. I know several people in my life, even family, who do mindfulness, they do a lot of meditation, it works for them. For me personally, when I've tried to do that stuff, because it gets me into my mind, even though meditation is supposed to get you out of your mind, for me, I'd suddenly start thinking of so many things at the same time. And then I'd be like battling with myself to have a quiet mind. And then afterwards thinking, why can't I meditate like everybody else? So it just wasn't this very peaceful experience. I think if it works for you, wonderful, do it. I know for me, what's worked a lot uh, faster and more dynamically is just to ask myself a question. What am I aware of here? Instantaneously, it takes me out of my mind and it takes me into the energy of what's going on, so I can have consciousness and awareness of what's happening rather than trying to figure out everything with the mind. So it's just been a lot faster and easier.
Do you think that's a form of mindfulness?
I would say it's a form of consciousness, which doesn't really exist when you're in your head and in your thoughts. I'd say the mind is very useful for a lot of things. And if you're trying to relax the mind, just sitting there and working on, quietening the mind could work. But if you also just do something entirely different, like going outside of yourself, questioning, okay, so what is this again? What else is possible? What you're doing is you're also training your mind to not always have to find the answers, so that you actually can relax and know that, okay, I can actually just ask a question and therefore start to notice different things around me. The same way as, if you decide you want to buy a red car, suddenly you start seeing red cars everywhere. Were they not there before, or are you just seeing them now because you asked the question? So when you ask these questions, you start to recognize things that perhaps were always there before, but you weren't noticing because you weren't looking for it. You weren't asking the question about it. So it's just a different approach.
So yeah, if I was to change the word mindfulness to like being in the present moment, like what's your thought on that? Because for me, like they mean very similar things, and I guess the point that I'm kind of coming to is that actually with the world being so external, um
Yeah.
like lots of stimuli in the world, let's actually sometimes having
Mm.
that disconnect kind of from that, where maybe we can then actually have more consciousness to even ask the question, right? But because a lot of us are so busy, we're working the job, we're going home, like if you have a family, like we don't even take that time
Yeah.
to stop to ask those questions. So then it's about, for me, like coming back to being in the present moment, which for me is like a form of mindfulness. So I don't actually know if like we're on this kind of the same path, but it's just the wording in stuff is
Yeah.
is
No, but
slightly
I think
different.
I think you're spot on. Like it does bring you into being present. And I think being present, however you get there, whichever, tool you use, whatever you want to call it, even if you're able to be present in the moment, that can change universes and it can create a lot of peace, because most of the time when we're not present, that's when we have the stress and the upset, and even, to a certain extent, the overstimulation. Not that you're not overstimulated, but I know that if somebody's making a loud noise next to me or yelling next to me, if I start then thinking, are they going to do it again? Are they going to do it again the same way they just did it before? Is it going to hurt me the same way as before? I'm already not present in the moment. I'm already thinking about what might happen next or what just happened 3 minutes ago. And so that's taken me out of presence. And now I'm getting stressed about something that might never happen because of what just happened. So whatever it is that you use to get in the present can really, really assist you. You know, for me, a question has been the fastest way to get into the present, because when you're asking a question, you have really no option but to be present with the question that you're asking in the very moment. So it's actually a really great technique that is very practical. But again, like you said, when you're in that, it's not always easy to remember, or when you're super busy and you've got five people talking to you, and you've got a meeting coming up and so many things going on. So I attempt to make life easy by myself by having post-its with the questions, like around my desk area, for example. You can't see my desk right now, but there are post-its. you know, and I have one on my bathroom mirror, just as a little reminder. And I have, my phone background is also a question, because otherwise it is so easy to get caught up in daily life. But I think if you can find tools that you can incorporate into your daily living so it becomes part of your lifestyle, it's so much easier than having to actually, you know, go and do a specific activity so that you can feel better during that time, although that, of course, is very valuable. But if you can, in addition, have something that you can add to your daily life and just have it be part of your, go to that you can do in a second without having to use a lot of props and stuff, and it's can be a huge contribution.
In terms of consciousness, so I've been asked this a lot, and I've been on my own consciousness journey, of even like coming to the understanding of what I perceive consciousness to be, because when I first started the podcast and everything I'm doing now, I used to describe it as like the wordless, like how can you put consciousness in how can you explain it to someone? And now I feel like I've come to a kind of okay place of doing so. So the question I wanted to put to you was, how would you, if there was somebody sat in front of you right now, or coming across this podcast, and they're coming across this kind of concept of consciousness for the first time, how would you explain consciousness to them? Like, what is
Yeah,
consciousness in your
I'd
eyes?
say consciousness includes everything and judges nothing, that simply. And it can seem oversimplistic, but actually, when you look at it, it's really the way that nature functions. It's the way that the earth functions and continues to thrive and adapt, regardless of what we do to it. It's the way that the universe functions, even on a scientific level. And so when you look at it that way, it can actually take a lot of the pressure off us trying to get things right or wrong, or even get consciousness right, you know. But what if truly consciousness includes everything and judges nothing?
Wow, I never heard that before. And neurodiversity as well. Like, obviously, there are these, as you mentioned beforehand, like these labels, autism, OCD, etc., etc.
Well, I'm not a medical doctor, but I can speak from firsthand experience, um, of being somebody who, has been labeled as autistic. To me, neurodiversity is exactly that. You neurologically, you are different than the masses, than a lot of the population. And I think a lot of what exists in our world has been designed for the masses. So now we're at a very exciting time, if you can see it that way, which I certainly do, where we're recognizing that there are these incredible individuals in the world that have a lot to offer because they are neurologically diverse. They are neurodiverse, so they will see things in a different way and they will
Mm.
find solutions to things in a different way than other people would. And that's incredibly valuable in every part of society. And to say that it's not is, absolutely just incorrect and crazy. And I think, we all know it, but all of the greatest inventions and all the advances that we've ever made, whether it's medically, scientifically, or in any other way, has always been because somebody has managed to look at things from a different perspective that hadn't been looked at before. And that is exactly what you have in neurodiverse people. Now, I know that it's it's a spectrum like we spoke about. So this isn't also to over glorify and say that if you're having problems with your child because they really, you know, cannot be left alone and be safe or whatever. Not to over glorify that, of course, but based on the conversation that we're having today, these people who are neurodiverse, I know for me, because I had to um, always be in a state of curiosity since I was young so that I could fit in, so that I could mask, so that I could get through school and, work life, where other people would take things for granted and they would just say, oh, that's the task that I'm supposed to do. There you go, I'll do it. I'd be asking, what does the teacher want from me? What are we talking about here? What do I need to do? How is everybody seeing this? How am I seeing this? And in that became very natural to be asking questions that I didn't even recognize I was asking, just to be able to get by, let alone thrive. And now to to be that creative, actually, because it is a huge level of creativity, most people need to be trained in that if they're neurotypical. They have to be trained to look outside the box and to ask those questions. Whereas for somebody who's neurodiverse, they are that inherently because they have to be that in order to know how to get through the day. So you've actually got this group of people who have this incredible sense of curiosity about the world that can actually really come up with incredible ideas.
No, definitely. Like it's interesting how like I've just read and seen, like some of the most creative minds of like the world, right? Actually, on some level, are like on this spectrum, right? Um, and so it just goes to show that actually this is to be celebrated. And I think society does like to put labels on things, and so and look, kind of look at like the differences and sort of like focus there, and actually, I think as again I read it like within your story that it's about celebrating kind of everything that we've spoken about today. One final question, and then if you have any final thoughts, would love to kind of dive into them. Based on the two questions that I just asked you in terms of consciousness and neurodiversity, where does awareness fit into both,
Yeah.
if that makes sense? And then, yeah, if you have any final thoughts or words of inspiration, I would love for you to share them before we wrap this up. But yeah, and awareness, like where does
Yeah,
awareness
I
fit
love
into
that.
both?
Um, well, awareness, the way that I see it, is something that goes beyond the mind, so it's beyond just what you've been taught. It's things that you can perceive without being told that you can perceive it. Like if somebody walks into a room and they're in a bad mood, have you ever been able to perceive that, sense it? Even if they haven't said a word and they have a smile on their face, you can sense it, right? There's something that's off, or you suddenly start to feel tense yourself. That is awareness. That's something that, cannot necessarily be taught, but you can become more conscious of it. So to me, consciousness and awareness go hand in hand. Once you've got one, you've got the other. The more conscious choices you make, the more you're allowing yourself to have awareness beyond just the literal, beyond just what's in front of you. And for me, people who are neurodiverse, although society will tell you that they're super sensitive, I would like to scrap that and say they're actually super aware. Because if you look at sensitivity, what is it? It's just something on a very high volume. So you might perhaps be angry at somebody and express that, and for a neurotypical person that might be on a volume 7, but for a neurodiverse person, their awareness of your energy, your intention, the tension in your body, what reactions you want to create, that is heightened to maybe 700. And so is it really sensitivity, or is it a heightened awareness? Now if we just say there's something wrong with you, neurodiverse person, for perceiving that, are they actually wrong, or are they actually receiving a lot more information than the neurotypical person who just takes it and goes, okay, this person's angry with me? So when we start to actually access more of our consciousness, how much more information are we going to be accessing? And I'm just talking here about people in a very simple awareness, maybe of somebody's mood or emotion in a particular moment. But imagine if you've got an emergency situation where people are going into their feelings and their emotions and their fear, and you have the neurotypical person who isn't really going into that because they're just not wired that way. They're seeing the bigger picture and they're asking questions when everybody's just going into reaction. What are you going to have there? You're going to have a very, very strong person who can perhaps find the solution and help everybody in that panic or emergency situation. And so there are so many different ways to see this, but to me, consciousness and awareness are not separate at all. When you have more awareness, you have more consciousness, because anytime that you're not really asking a question, you're not expanding your consciousness or your awareness.
Diva, thank you so much for your time today. Do you have any like quick final thoughts, quick nuggets that you would like to share? And if not, absolutely fine. Like, where can people find you online if they want to learn more about your work
Thank
and
you.
what you do?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that the thing that I have found the most working with people in all ranges of the spectrum, from people who are nonverbal and have never been verbal, to people who are, physically impaired, and just, all the extremes of it, is again going back to the judgment that you mentioned, Luke. And I think to me, it's so key to not only try and get out of the judgment, because when we're judging, we often don't realize we're judging. We just think we're right. That's the insidious thing about judgment. We just go, no, I'm not judging. I'm just right. I am messed up. Look, here's the evidence. Um, so I think if you're able to be in the question and ask, okay, so what else is possible here that I haven't considered? Or how does it get any better than this? Or, you know what? Maybe I am right here. Maybe I am completely messed up. But if I wasn't, what could I choose here? What other choices do I have that other people don't have? Because the way that I think, because of my difference, the more you start to ask those questions, what happens is those questions will begin to be louder than the self judgment. So rather than trying to fight against the self judgment, what if you start fighting for being in question about everything? It's incredible how when you turn up the volume on one thing, the volume on the other thing turns down automatically. So, I'd say just remember that if you feel that you're messed up, it's probably the opposite. It's probably some kind of capacity that you've got there that you're not recognizing as a strength that you have, just because perhaps nobody else around you has that similar strength. So you're not seeing it being used to its full advantage. You're just seeing yourself and going, how do I do this? Because nobody's teaching you or giving you the tools. But I'd say if you do feel wrong, just know that you're not. Okay. Ask, what capacity do I have here? If I wasn't wrong here, if I weren't wrong, what talent would this be? So yeah, I'd say that's the main thing. And then please check out, accessconsciousness.com has got so many resources, and you can find me there. It's just accessconsciousness.com/Diva Diaz, or my website, which is divadiaz.com.
Diva, thank you so much for your time today. I've learned a lot, as I always do during these conversations, and hopefully hopefully like our audience has as well, and that we can stay in touch as well to continue to learn from each other and raise consciousness together. So thank you for your time today. And for more after today's show, be sure to head on over to raisingconsciousness.show to get all of the show notes, transcriptions, videos for each episode, and a hell of a lot more. And if you got value from this episode, found it insightful, or learned a thing or two, please leave a review where you can let everyone know that this show is worth checking out. I appreciate you so much. You'll be hearing from me in the next episode.